Our next guest is renowned in Australia but also overseas as the documentarian spokeswoman for disability with her first doco, Untold Desires. She's actually got over 20 years experience in the biz and swings between both the indie scenes as well as the television network scene too. Now, her work often explores the misconstrued areas of mental and emotional health issues as well as disabilities and human rights. Now, she's actually been able to help raise awareness in these fields on an international scale. So much so that her work has been recognised by receiving a Logie Award as well as an AFI Award. So with that, let's head back to the Bite Size Picture Studios and meet with the incomparable Sarah Barton. Sarah, thanks for joining us here in the studio.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, when it comes to being a documentarian, now you established your production company, Fertile Films, back in 1993. And since then, you've been creating these amazing documentaries that kind of give life and give a voice to kind of certain areas that aren't necessarily always brought to the surface. So what is it about documentaries that got you involved in the first place?
Well, I never actually trained as a documentary filmmaker. When I was at film school, I made a comedy as my graduating piece, and I've actually just recently gone back to doing a little bit of comedy. But I really had no aspirations to make documentaries at all. But I had started this little production company with a friend of mine from uni, Eva Orner, who now has her own very successful career as a documentary filmmaker as well. And Eva and I were in our office, you know, open for business, thinking, what are we going to do now, you know?
Let's get things going.
And we saw an ad in Encore from SBS, and it said, you know, calling documentary filmmakers, you know, we'd like submissions for documentaries. And I'd had this idea that I'd suggested to another friend of mine to make a documentary about sexuality and disability. And my friend had sort of toyed with it for a moment or two and then never made that film. And so I thought, oh, maybe we should just pitch this sex and disability idea, you know. So we did a bit of research, and I sort of wrote a few pages of something, and we sent it into SBS. And at the time, like, in order to get film funding, you know, you had to do, you were shortlisted, and then you were interviewed, and then, you know, there was this reasonably rigorous process, but not at SBS, which was great. And so about 3 months later, when we'd completely forgotten about it all, I got a phone call from the commissioning editor at SBS, and he said, oh, hello, is that Sarah? I just wanted to say we'd like to commission your film. And I was like, he'd never met me, he'd never seen any of my work, anything like that. And I was like, oh, okay, fabulous. He said, look, he said, the proposal could do with a bit more work. We'd like you to do a bit more work on it, but we really love the idea and we want you to make the film. So it's definitely something we want, and we just, you know, wanted to let you know, but you do need to go away and do some more work. So we went away and did a bit more work. It was probably another 5 or 6 months before we actually got the money to do the film. So by that stage, we were starving. But that was really the luckiest first break into the industry.
Wow. From a female perspective, when it comes to being in the business, what's the kind of journey been for you? Like, spanning the 20-year career you've had so far, from where you began to where you are now, what's been that journey for you?
Well, look, I guess for me, I sometimes think if I didn't have children, I may have had quite a different career. But for me, children have been, I've been a parent forever because my children, the eldest and youngest, are 19 years apart. So that's just insanity, but, you know, that's my life. So, and for me, there's always been this sort of practical necessity to actually make my work fit around the commitments that I have to bring up my kids, whether it's getting to childcare on time or, you know, having to do a school run in the morning or that sort of thing. So I've never really been in a position to go off on a 3-month Hollywood shoot and work, you know, like, I can't do that. You know, I can't do that to my family. I can't, because I can't dictate those hours. So I've sort of deliberately kept things relatively small. Sometimes when I've had a kind of grueling shoot on, it's a relatively short-term thing. So it might be once every 2 or 3 years, I just go onto a 1 or 2 or 3 week shoot where, you know, you don't see me for dust. And but it's not what I do week in, week out, or sort of, you know, it's the main part of what I do, researching, writing, producing, you know, post-production. You know, that's what I spend most of my time doing, and I can manage it with family commitments. And I think that's a really big thing for women because, you know, the reality is that I suppose I'm not the main breadwinner in my family. If I was the main breadwinner, then maybe I could get away with, you know, tripping off to somewhere and doing a 3-month shoot, but I'm not. So I then have to make it fit around family. And I think that's a reality for many, many women in this business.
And we were talking earlier actually about how you've been able to create your work autonomously and kind of work on your own. Do you find that that's helped you when it came to that time period when you were having children to actually be able to create and build your own network
Absolutely. Like I needed to be the big fish in the small pond, and you know, sometimes I'm the only one in the pond. You know, like other times I have other fish come and play with me. You know, like, little ones. But yeah, I needed to have that control because I remember when I first started, my first job out of film school was actually working for a production company that made TV commercials, and I was a trainee producer, and you know, I was quite good at it and all of that sort of thing. But my boss used to do things like he'd go, oh, we're going to go and do a colour grade and we're going to start at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'd be like, oh no, that means I'm not going to get to, you know, it's going to go 3 hours. And, you know, and I would stress, I would actually make myself feel sick about the fact that how was I going to ask to get out of that colour grade at 5:30 so I could get to childcare on time and pick up my son, you know. And it was incredibly stressful. So I mean, obviously I'm older now and I would have just said, sorry, no can do. But in those days I was younger, I was trying to impress, I was trying to do my best and, you know, be a good little girl. And I didn't speak up about those sort of things. And whilst I know in 20 years things have changed, I don't know that this industry has changed that much.
There's lots of obstacles like we've just been speaking about as well. How do you overcome them? Like, how do you rectify that to move forward to get your work out there?
Look, I don't know that. I think it's just about being tenacious and persistent and believing in what you're doing. And look, sometimes I feel like I'm not getting my work out. Why is someone throwing large amounts of money at me to make this thing happen? Look, I'm working on a film at the moment that I hope will be finished in 2015. I've been working on it for 5 or 6 years, and I sometimes wonder, you know, like I don't have a broadcaster involved. I've had a little bit of script development from Screen Australia and Film Victoria. I've had a handful of small, you know, sort of grants to make the film. The budget really for such an ambitious film is minuscule, and you just think to yourself, you know, could I have done a better job of raising the money for this? Should I have abandoned it 5 years ago when there was no interest? But I know that, you know, it's a documentary about the history of the disability rights movement, and I know it's timely. I knew 5 years ago that it would be an interesting film, and I know that it's worth doing. So, but that belief in the face of absolute ambivalence from broadcasters and all of that, you know, and they've sort of trends have sort of caught up with me. I do have a bit of a tendency to be able to see things coming a bit, you know.
Great.
But I'm not a commercial animal. I'm not someone who's interested in providing content, factual content for broadcasters, because I don't want a broadcaster telling me, oh, I want a presenter like this in my show, and you know, this is how we want the content delivered. I do actually just see myself as a bit of an independent artist. You know, who hopes to reach a broad audience, but I really am not a producer of content.
Well, one final question for you, Sarah. Being in the industry for 20 years now, you've probably come along some like advice or anything along the way. What's been the best piece of advice that you've been given?
An element of self-belief, and that's something that I think young women sometimes don't have as much of as they could have, you know, really believing in their intelligence and ability to get things done, and just persistence.
Thanks for joining us here in Bite Size Pictures studio.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
The thing about Sarah Barton is just her open and honest demeanour. I mean, it is so refreshing considering that she has been in the business for over 20 years. And look, sometimes this industry can be pretty cynical, but her intelligence and her wit and can-do attitude are just examples of what she does to ensure that she's always advancing her career any which way she can. And she is an inspiration to emerging and established artists, particularly women, to remind ourselves to always remain steadfast, true to ourselves, but then also go after our goals regardless of the circumstances.